He wasn't supposed to be at the wheel. A slave wasn't allowed near the helm, let alone steer a warship through enemy waters. But that night, under a moonless sky, and with a noose waiting if he failed, Malcolm Reddick stood tall, dressed in the stolen coat of a Confederate captain, guiding a ship full of escaped slaves straight past 3 heavily guarded southern forts. One wrong signal, and they'd all be blasted into the river. 1 second of hesitation in history would have never remembered his name. But Malcolm had a plan, and tonight, he wasn't just stealing a ship, he was stealing back his freedom. The night air tasted like coal dust and salt. Malcolm Reddick scrubbed the upper deck of the SS Providence with a half-rotted brush, one hand on the bristles, the other curled loosely around a rusted water bucket. He worked slow, deliberate. Not because he was lazy, he knew better than to appear anything but obedient in the eyes of the white officers pacing above him, but because he was listening, counting, watching. 3 pairs of boots, one with a limp, one that dragged its heel on every other step, the third sharp, snappy, always leading. That was Captain Norris, the one Malcolm studied the most. Over the last 6 months, Malcolm had memorized the rhythms of those boots, the cadence of authority. He knew the difference between a casual stroll and a shift change. He could predict when Norris would pause to light his pipe, or when Lieutenant Barrett would bark an insult just to hear himself speak. These details were lifelines, threads he wove together in the quiet hours between labor and exhaustion. Ashford, Mississippi was a place where hope went to rot. A swamp-rimmed port packed with gunboats, cotton freighters, and the bones of those who had tried and failed to escape. To the Confederacy, Ashford was a strategic artery. To Malcolm, it was a cage with sails. He had worked the Providence for nearly 3 years. At first, they'd kept him below-deck boiler duty, shoveling coal in a hellish furnace that never cooled. But Malcolm was smart. Too smart. He learned fast, kept his mouth shut, and watched everything. So they moved him up to deckhand, then boathook, and now still technically a slave, he handled mooring lines and knew every inch of that vessel better than most white men aboard it. But none of it meant anything. Not really. Because Loretta and Elias, his wife and son, were still down the hill, in the slave quarters behind the munitions barn. And last week, Malcolm had overheard something that turned his stomach cold. A shipment was leaving next Friday, 20 heads. Most of them children, the ones too young to work or too pretty to stay. That's what Captain Norris had said as casually as if discussing sacks of grain, and Malcolm had heard the name Elias slip from his lips like it was nothing. That night, Malcolm didn't sleep. He sat on an overturned barrel outside the laundry shed, elbows on knees, staring at the dirt like it owed him answers. Loretta came out an hour before sunrise. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat beside him, handed him a piece of bread she'd hidden from her own supper, and rested her shoulder against his. "I won't survive it again," she whispered. "If they take him, I won't." She didn't cry. Loretta never cried. That was what scared him most. By the next day, Malcolm knew what he had to do. It was insane, suicidal, treasonous. But he had watched Norris pilot that ship 100 times. He knew the signals, the tides, the timing of the guards at each checkpoint. He knew where the Confederate flags were stored and how to mimic the salute of a Southern officer. What he didn't know, he could figure out. He always had. The only thing he needed now was time and silence. Over the next 5 nights, Malcolm made his rounds like nothing had changed. He cleaned the same brass fittings, polished the same railings, and let the officers talk over his head like he was invisible. They always did. That was their mistake. He spoke to no one but 3 other slaves he trusted with his life, Jacob, the engineer's assistant, Ruth, a quiet woman who once smuggled a map through her apron, and Sam, a boy no older than 17 but fast and sharp-eyed. Together they would do what no slave had dared. They would steal a Confederate warship, and they'd do it with wives, children, and freedom tucked into the belly of that iron beast. Because Malcolm wasn't just trying to escape, he was taking his people with him. The plan was simple, at least it had to be. Complicated meant chaos, and chaos would get them all killed. Malcolm spent each day moving like a shadow between decks, still silent, still obedient, but behind his lowered eyes a storm was building. He studied the timing of every guard rotation, noted which officers drank too much on which nights, and listened for shifts in the rhythm of the ship. He learned that on Friday nights, most of the ranking whites attended a poker game at the captain's quarters 3 blocks away from the harbor. That was when the ship would be most vulnerable, most unsupervised. It would be then or never. The challenge wasn't just stealing the ship. It was getting his family and the others on board without raising suspicion. Loretta worked in the laundry house behind the munitions barn, and she had one friend there, Ruth, who already knew the risk. Ruth had lost 2 children to the auction block. She didn't even blink when Malcolm asked for help. "You think I care if I die?" she whispered, folding a shirt over her knees. "Just let me die doing something that matters." Jacob, the engine man, had access to the boiler room. Sam handled loading supplies on and off deck. He could slip things into places no one looked twice. And Malcolm, by some miracle, had earned enough blind trust to be left alone on deck for hours at a time. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Each night that week, Malcolm rehearsed the signals. Taps on the rail, 2 short knocks, 1 long, the sound of coal being shoveled twice. He practiced the Confederate salutes in the shadows, mimicking Captain Norris's drawl under his breath. The others practiced too. Ruth wrapping bandages like she was hiding them, Sam memorizing the locations of escape ropes, Jacob checking and rechecking the furnace timing. They didn't need faith. They needed precision. By Thursday, the final detail was in place. Loretta and Elias would be hidden inside 2 barrels marked for food storage. Ruth would slip in behind the linen cart. Malcolm would guide them through the cargo bay before the rest of the crew even realized they were aboard. Still, the night before, something shifted in Malcolm's gut. He sat alone under the skeletal frame of the ship's crane, watching the moon vanish behind clouds. Everything was set, every piece in place, but he couldn't sleep. What if something went wrong? What if they were caught before they even left the dock? What if Loretta screamed when the soldiers grabbed her boy? What if after all this he died with nothing but failure to his name? He felt a hand rest on his shoulder. "Loretta, I can hear you thinking," she said gently. Her voice was low, steady. "You don't have to be perfect, Malcolm. You just have to get us to that water. God will do the rest." Malcolm didn't answer, but he held her hand, calloused and cracked like his, and felt her breath near his neck. Her strength had always been his compass. At dawn, they parted without words. The ship buzzed with routine as soldiers laughed and cursed and barked orders above deck. No one paid him any attention. No one ever did. By midday, Jacob gave the signal from the furnace room, "Fire's stable." By sundown, Sam whispered from behind a crate of rifles, "Guards are thinning." And by 2:00 a.m., Ruth had already hidden the first barrel beneath a tarp. Malcolm stood at the helm just after 2:30, hands trembling as he slid on the stolen officer's coat. It didn't fit quite right, too wide at the shoulders, too clean for someone who had scrubbed rust from iron rails since he was 16. But when he looked at his reflection in the brass wheel housing, he saw something he'd never dared to imagine before. A captain, not in name, not in rank, but in purpose. The air was still. The dock was quiet. Somewhere down the shoreline, a dog barked once and then fell silent. Malcolm gripped the wheel. 2 short taps, 1 long. Jacob started the engine. The ship groaned beneath them like something ancient waking from sleep. Malcolm gave a single nod. They were moving, and this time no one was steering them but him. The SS Providence crept from the harbor like a ghost in its own graveyard. Every groan of the hull, every shift in the current, every snap of canvas overhead felt deafening in the stillness. Malcolm stood at the helm, fingers gripping the wooden wheel, not with fear, but with a stillness so focused it bordered on sacred. Behind him in the hold, the weight of lives pressed against the silence. Loretta, Elias, Ruth, Sam, Jacob. They were all down there trusting him, depending on him, holding their breath in the darkness. The moon had vanished completely behind a thick curtain of clouds, and the river stretched ahead like a black ribbon of consequence. They had exactly 90 minutes to reach the first checkpoint, Fort Delby, before the sun hinted at the horizon. Malcolm had memorized the signals used by Confederate ships for passage. If he hesitated even once, if his hands trembled as he gave the wrong flare or blew the wrong sequence on the horn, they'd all be reduced to smoke and fire in the blink of an eye. He glanced toward Jacob, who stood crouched behind a set of stacked crates, his hand resting on a lever that controlled the steam flow. They exchanged no words. None were needed. They were past words now. As they approached the bend in the river, where the water narrowed between a tangle of cypress roots and high reeds, Malcolm reached for the signal lever. He exhaled through his nose, slow and steady, then tugged the cord twice, short bursts of sound, and once more, longer, deeper, echoing down the waterway, like a ghost tapping on the walls of a mausoleum. There was a pause, one that lasted no more than 5 seconds, though. To Malcolm, it stretched into an eternity. The fort ahead remained still. No shouts, no spotlights. Then from the shore, the low and familiar answer, two short horns mimicking his own. Permission granted. Malcolm allowed his hands to relax just slightly on the wheel. Not too much. Not yet. This was only the first checkpoint. They still had Fort Owen and Fort Mason ahead, both better staffed, better lit, and commanded by men less easily fooled. But they were past the first line. The plan was holding. Below deck, Loretta crouched beside the barrels, one hand over Elias's mouth, though he wasn't making a sound. The boy had not cried once. Not when they rolled him inside, not when the ship jerked forward, not even when the groan of the boiler echoed through the planks beneath him. He simply held his mother's arm and stared at her, with eyes too knowing for his age. "It's working," Ruth whispered her, back against a wall of canvas sacks. "We're moving." Loretta didn't answer, but her hand slipped from her son's mouth to his chest, resting above his heart, like she was holding something fragile and already fading. Back on deck, Malcolm tightened his coat collar against the rising wind. The river widened here, opening into a flat expanse where the lights of Fort Owen would be visible within minutes. It was the most dangerous stretch, too open, too exposed, with a clear line of sight from the watchtowers on both banks. He needed to maintain the illusion to look every bit the Confederate officer returning from a supply run. He straightened his back, adjusted the hat on his head, and began pacing the deck with the same haughty gait he'd seen Captain Norris use after drinking too much whiskey. Shoulders back, chin-up, hands clasped behind his spine. It wasn't confidence. It was theater. The lights of Fort Owen came into view like a constellation rising from the earth. Malcolm raised the spyglass, noting the positions of the guards. One at the southern watch post, two pacing the wall walk, a third lighting a lantern near the cannon turret. He inhaled, counted to 5, then issued the next signal. One long horn followed by a flicker of lantern light shielded behind his coat. It was a precise code used by Confederate ships returning from midnight courier missions, rare but not unheard of. He'd seen it only once, and remembered. A shadow stirred on the fort's upper level. One of the soldiers lifted a torch and raised it in return. Then nothing. Malcolm didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then slowly the spotlight turned away. Permission granted. The ship passed, and still no one above deck spoke a word. The river narrowed again after Fort Owen, curling like a spine through the marshes. Trees leaned over the banks, their mossy arms reaching low, as if to brush the backs of those who passed beneath them. Malcolm didn't release his grip on the wheel, not even as the shadows grew longer and the wind pushed against the bow. They had cleared 2 checkpoints, yes, but the third was different. Fort Mason sat at the edge of the old naval yard, a massive stone sentinel built to intimidate. Its guns faced the channel like jaws waiting to bite, and its commanders, known for shooting first and asking after, held little patience for late-night traffic, even from their own. To pass Fort Mason would take more than mimicry. It would take nerve. Malcolm adjusted the brim of his hat again. The stiffness of the fabric scratched against his brow, but he welcomed the discomfort. It kept him alert, reminded him this wasn't a dream. Dreams didn't sweat through uniforms or carry the weight of 7 lives in the hull of a stolen ship. Jacob emerged from below, his face slick with heat and soot, and nodded once. The boilers were holding just enough pressure to push them forward without drawing too much smoke. Any more and they'd risk alerting patrols with the column of black ash that normally spewed from the Providence's stack. Malcolm had asked him to burn low, and Jacob, like always, had delivered. They were close now. The lights of Fort Mason shimmered across the water, too many to count brighter than the others. Search beams swept the banks like knives slicing the night. Malcolm timed the rotation. 8 seconds from left to right. Another 8 to return. He'd have to pass through that open window like threading a needle blindfolded. He tapped the deck twice, signaling Sam to ready the signal lantern. Then, slipping a length of cloth from inside his coat, Malcolm began to wrap it around the brass fittings of the helm, dulling any shine. He wasn't leaving anything to chance. A glint at the wrong time might be all it took for a soldier to cry out, and then it would be cannon fire, not questions. Below deck, Loretta clutched Elias closer. The boy had begun to tremble, not from fear, but from the cold. The air near the floor was damp, the kind that seeped into bone and stayed there. She pulled her shawl tighter around him, humming under her breath. Not a lullaby, just a tone. A steady hum like a lifeline, a sound to keep him tethered to something other than terror. Ruth, her face pale but calm, whispered, "Are we close?" Loretta hesitated, then nodded. Too close. Back above, Malcolm lit the lantern just once, briefly shielding the glow with his body, then dousing it again. It was the final signal, the last lie. If Fort Mason bought it, they'd pass into open water, and freedom would no longer be a word spoken in secret. If they didn't, well, at least he would die on his feet. The searchlight passed. Once, twice. On the third swing, it stopped. Malcolm's breath caught. The light hovered on their deck, tracing along the railing, pausing at the smokestack, then moving slowly toward the helm. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He stood still, every muscle locked, as if he'd been carved from the very wheel he gripped. Then just as suddenly, the beam continued its path. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, his jaw-tight eyes still fixed ahead. He didn't dare look back at the fort. That would break character. That would betray the stillness he'd worked so hard to hold. A single horn blew from the shoreline, 2 short bursts, then silence. It was over. Fort Mason had let them pass. No one cheered, no one cried out. But the air around Malcolm shifted. He could feel it, like the ship itself had exhaled with him, like the river had recognized their defiance and allowed it. Only then did he glance at the faint pink smudge on the horizon. Dawn was coming, and with it a choice. He could either turn inland, following the narrow tributary that led to Confederate waters, or steer boldly eastward toward the Atlantic, where Union ships patrolled and hope had a name. He turned the wheel east. The eastern current was stronger than Malcolm expected. It pulled at the hull like an impatient hand, as though the ocean itself had been waiting for him to make this choice. He tightened his grip on the wheel, feeling the resistance in the rudder as he angled the ship toward deeper water. Behind him, the last hints of Fort Mason dissolved into the mist, its looming threat replaced by the cold, indifferent vastness of the open sea. There were no more checkpoints now, no more gates to unlock or signals to fake. But this stretch was somehow more terrifying. Because up ahead, somewhere beyond the haze, lay the Union blockade. Ships with guns just as deadly as the ones they'd slipped past, manned by soldiers who wouldn't recognize him, who wouldn't pause to ask questions if a Confederate vessel suddenly appeared out of the fog. He knew how they thought. He would have thought the same. Malcolm scanned the horizon, searching for the outline of a mast or a flash of polished brass. Nothing yet, just waves and sky and the rising breath of dawn. He motioned to Sam, who had taken position near the bow, with a scrap of white cloth clenched in his hand. A flag of surrender, of peace, of desperation. It hardly mattered. It was all they had. Below deck, Loretta pressed her ear to the planks. She heard no shouting, no gunfire, only the deep rhythmic churn of water against wood. Her heart pounded in counterpoint. Beside her, Ruth sat with eyes closed, whispering scripture under her breath, not for comfort, but for discipline. She didn't want to panic, not now, not after coming so far. Elias had fallen asleep at last, curled against his mother's lap fingers, still clutching the hem of her dress. His tiny breaths steadied her more than any promise of safety ever could. The sun broke the horizon just as Malcolm spotted the first shadow, a long dark shape rising through the mist like a godless mountain. Union ironclad. He didn't need a spyglass to confirm it. The silhouette was unmistakable. The curved armor, the twin cannons, the absence of sails. The kind of vessel built to end wars quickly. He raised his hand to Sam. The boy lifted the white cloth and began waving slow and wide like he'd practiced. Malcolm counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Still nothing from the Union ship. He kept the Providence steady, slowing the engine to a low thrum. The silence dragged out longer than any battle cry. Then a low horn split the air, one long, rumbling note from the ironclad, followed by 2 sharp blasts. Malcolm froze. That wasn't a signal of welcome. It was a challenge. He turned to Jacob, who had just come above deck, squinting into the rising sun. "They think we're Confederate," Malcolm said, voice tight. "They're readying their guns." Jacob didn't blink. "Then give 'em a reason not to fire." Malcolm nodded once and stepped to the edge of the helm. With deliberate motion, he shed the officer's coat, the same one that had shielded him all night, and tossed it overboard. It hit the water with a wet smack and sank fast, swallowed like a lie. Then he grabbed the remaining rope on deck and tied the white cloth to the highest mast. It flapped weakly in the morning breeze. He shouted across the water loud enough to tear his throat. "We are not Confederates. We are escaped slaves. We surrender the ship." The words echoed, torn by wind and water. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then movement. A second Union ship emerged from the mist, flanking the first. A smaller vessel, faster, more agile, turned toward the Providence, its deck bustling with sailors. One of them raised a looking glass, stared long and hard, then turned to shout something back toward the command post. A red flare shot into the air. Not a signal to fire, but a call for cease movement. They were going to board. Malcolm stepped back from the wheel, heart hammering against his ribs. He felt hands wrap around his, the small warm fingers of Sam. The boy didn't say a word. He didn't have to. They had made it. But now came the hardest part of all, convincing the free world that they were worth saving. The boarding party came fast, their longboat cutting through the water like a blade, its oars slicing with practiced rhythm. Malcolm remained at the helm, shoulders squared, hands at his sides, resisting the instinct to lower his eyes or step back. He knew the truth. The moment he flinched, the moment he looked like a man begging instead of standing, was the moment he lost whatever fragile authority he still held over this stolen vessel. The Union sailors climbed aboard with rifles drawn and eyes sharp. Their uniforms were damp with sea spray. In tension, their boots echoing across the deck in staccato bursts. The one in charge, a lieutenant not much older than Malcolm, looked him up and down with a mix of suspicion and confusion. He pointed to the lowered Confederate flag still tied near the mast and said, "Where's your commanding officer?" Malcolm didn't blink. "I'm the one who brought this ship in." The lieutenant's brows furrowed. His gaze flicked toward the others emerging cautiously from below deck. Jacob, with hands raised, Ruth helping Loretta steady herself, and Sam, standing protectively in front of Elias, who stared wide-eyed at the armed strangers. "You're telling me you stole a Confederate gunship?" "No, sir," Malcolm said evenly. "I took it back." It should have been a triumphant moment, but instead of applause or even acknowledgement, what followed was a silence so thick it muffled the sounds of the sea itself. The lieutenant said nothing. He gestured instead to his men, who quickly moved through the ship, searching, questioning, cataloging faces like they were items in an auction. One of them pried open the weapons locker. Another climbed into the crow's nest. Every creak of wood underfoot felt like a judgment. Malcolm was separated from the others and taken aboard the Union ship, where he was placed in a small, windowless room no bigger than a pantry. There was no yelling, no beating, just waiting. Just hours passed. The ship swayed gently, and in the stillness, doubt crept in like cold. He tried to hold on to Loretta's voice, to the look in Elias's eyes when the flare went up to Sam's hand, gripping his own in that final moment before surrender. But the room had a way of shrinking memory, of making even the clearest convictions feel distant and frayed. When the door finally opened, it was not the lieutenant who entered, but a man with silver at his temples, in the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. He carried no weapon, only a folder and a tired expression. "I'm Commander Whitmore," the man said. "I've read your statement." "Impressive story." Malcolm didn't answer. He'd learned early that words meant less than silence in the wrong ears. Whitmore took a seat. "Here's the problem. If what you're saying is true, then you, an untrained civilian, successfully navigated a military vessel through 3 Confederate checkpoints while evading detection and delivered it into Union hands with no casualties. That makes you either the luckiest man alive or a spy." "I had everything to lose," Malcolm replied softly. "A spy doesn't bring his wife and child on board." Whitmore studied him for a long moment. Then he opened the folder, revealing maps, signal logs, even the Confederate communication codes Malcolm had used still scrawled in pencil on a torn scrap of linen handed over by Ruth during the inspection. "I don't know whether to court-martial you for treason or pin a medal on your chest," the commander muttered. Malcolm allowed himself a thin smile. "I'm not asking for either. Just don't send us back." Whitmore closed the folder and stood. "The men upstairs want to see you. Some don't believe your story. Some don't care. But I think you're the kind of man who only needs one chance to prove everything." As Malcolm followed him out, the hallway smelled of salt and gun oil, but the air was clearer. When they reached the deck, the sky had changed. The fog had burned off. The sun shone bright on the horizon, cutting through the last of the doubt. And there across the rail, Malcolm saw them, Loretta Ruth, Jacob Sam, and Elias squinting into the sun with a hand raised to his brow like a sailor learning to read the light. The hearing was brief but not painless. A panel of Union officers sat behind a long oak table in a drafty courthouse near the Virginia coast, their faces lined with skepticism in the weariness of war. Malcolm stood alone before them, no uniform, no legal counsel, just the same steady hands that had once gripped a stolen helm through enemy waters. He answered their questions without embellishment, corrected their assumptions without apology, and never once asked for mercy. They pressed him on tactics, on motive, on the identities of those he had smuggled aboard. One officer, a colonel with a voice like gravel, asked why he hadn't destroyed the ship instead of delivering it. Malcolm looked him in the eye and said, "Because fire doesn't free anyone. It only leaves ashes. I needed something that could carry us forward." When it was over, the room emptied slowly, chairs scraping across stone floors like drag chains. Malcolm remained in place until Commander Whitmore approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "They believed you," Whitmore said simply. "Maybe not all of them, but enough." A week later, Malcolm received a letter sealed with the insignia of the Navy Department. It informed him in curt language that he had been granted full freedom under federal protection, along with citizenship rights for himself and his family. Attached was a second page, an offer of employment. Maritime Inspector, Southern District. An advisory position newly created, quietly authorized, and unprecedented. Malcolm sat with the letter in his lap for hours, turning it over between his fingers, like it might vanish if held too tightly. He didn't tell Loretta immediately. He simply watched her hang linens in the sun outside the small boarding house where they were staying, her arms moving with the same quiet rhythm as the river had on that final night. When he did show her, she read the first paragraph, smiled, then folded the page carefully and tucked it into her apron. "I told you," she whispered. "God doesn't need noise to move a ship." The ceremony, such as it was, took place on a dock behind a Union supply outpost. No stage, no band, just a handful of officers and a brass plaque that would be mounted near the docks in Norfolk. Commander Whitmore handed Malcolm the citation with a firm nod, then offered a small box lined with velvet. Inside was a medal no one had ever seen before because no one had ever earned it. The Civil Liberty Medal, a new honor, not for soldiers, not for politicians, but for someone who had dared to steal his freedom and live long enough to deliver it. "You may not see statues built," Whitmore said quietly, "but this is more than most men get." Malcolm didn't speak. He just looked out toward the harbor where a new ship was being fitted, one that would soon carry families like his to new towns, new work, new beginnings. In the months that followed, Malcolm used his position to inspect vessels for fairness, safety, and more often than not, humanity. He reported abuses, advocated for former slaves trying to earn licenses to work on the water. He knew the roots of trade, yes, but more importantly, he understood the roots of dignity. And he knew that freedom, if not protected, was nothing more than a borrowed name. He never ran for office, never stood at a podium. He preferred the docks, the engines, the sound of ships creaking in the morning tide. But his presence changed things, slowly, steadily, like a rudder beneath the surface. 15 years later, one of the boys from his training program became the first black ship captain registered in the state of Virginia. He named his boat the Reddick Star. On the day it launched, he sent a letter to Malcolm, now living quietly near the bay, with only one sentence inside: "You taught me how to steer into the wind." That spring, Elias turned 21. He came home with calloused hands and stories of working tugboats along the East Coast. One evening, while fixing a railing on the porch, he asked Papa, "Do you ever wish you hadn't taken the ship that night?" Malcolm looked up from his chair, took a long breath, and smiled, not with pride, but with a peace hard won. "No," he said. "I only wish I'd learned sooner that I was never meant to be cargo. I was always the one holding the compass." If this story moved you, if it reminded you that freedom is never given, but taken with courage, please consider sharing it with someone who still needs hope. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for remembering the names history tried to erase. Until next time, stay brave, stay human.